It was 1943. The tide of war was changing across the Atlantic. German troops were falling apart in North Africa, and the Allies were getting ready for the next big thrust in Europe. Thousands of German prisoners of war, who had been captured in Tunisia and other places, were sent across the Atlantic to the U.S. For a lot of them, it was the first time they saw the land they had been taught was weak, chaotic, and not able to handle a lengthy battle. What they saw instead shocked them. As the trains took these POWs throughout America, they saw something that went against everything Nazi propaganda had told them. Smoke erupted from tall manufacturing chimneys for miles and miles. There were limitless railroad lines, and every train was full with steel, coal, or machinery. The captives, still in their field gray uniforms, pushed their faces against the glass to see the sleeping giant show its real force. Detroit became the ultimate revelation. Known as the Arsenal of Democracy, the city's industrial strength had been retooled from civilian autos to the mass manufacturing of tanks, aircraft, and trucks. German officers and enlisted men alike could not believe the scale. They had been taught America was soft, its people unwilling to sacrifice. But here was a nation mobilized in full, an entire populace driving an industrial machine unlike any other in history. At the Ford River Rouge plant, assembly lines once meant for sedans and coupes now produced the backbone of American armor, the M4 Sherman tank. The River Rouge complex stretched across hundreds of acres, or entered one end. Completed machines rolled out the other. Inside, overhead cranes thundered, conveyor belts moved without pause, and sparks from welding torches lit up the cavernous halls like flashes of lightning. To the German captives who observed this massive operation, it seemed almost inhuman in scale, a mechanical beast that could never be stopped. The Chrysler Arsenal brought another shock. This vast factory in Warren, Michigan, has been developed exclusively for the construction of tanks. Where once luxurious vehicles had rolled off the lines, now rows of Sherman tanks stood waiting to be tested. Day and night, thousands of American workers, men and women alike, labored to keep the lines moving. The beat was unrelenting, every machine element fitting into place with perfect precision. For the prisoners who had come from a Europe battered by shortages, bombings, and rationing, the sheer abundance of raw material in America was almost incomprehensible. Many POWs later recounted their disbelief. They had imagined the United States as a land of farmers, still emerging from the Great Depression, unable to compete with Germany's disciplined factories. Instead, they discovered a nation where industry had been mobilized on a scale far beyond anything the Reich could match. America's factories did not simply build machines. They built confidence. They ensured that when U.S. forces met the enemy on the battlefield, they would not be outnumbered, outgunned, or undersupplied. The numbers alone told the story. By 1943, American companies were producing thousands of tanks each month. The Sherman, albeit criticized for its poor armor compared to German Panthers and Tigers, was available in overwhelming quantities. Where Germany struggled to replace its losses, America simply rolled new machinery out of the factory gates. For every tank destroyed in North Africa or on the Italian front, additional awaited shipping over the Atlantic. It was a battle of attrition, and America's production capacity ensured that the balance would never swing in Germany's favor. But beyond the figures, what startled the inmates most was the spirit of the workers themselves. At the River Rouge and Chrysler facilities, women riveters, African-American laborers, and immigrant workers toiled side by side, unified in a common goal. The Nazis had viewed such diversity as weakness. Now their captured men saw it converted into a formidable strength. This was a workforce that never appeared to fatigue, sustained by the notion that every tank constructed, every engine produced, moved the fight closer to triumph. The German officers realized the ramifications instantly. They had believed their battle could be won through technical supremacy and blitzkrieg tactics. But America's policy was different. Victory would be accomplished not by lone brilliance, but by overwhelming output, by the ability to outbuild, outlast, and outsupply the enemy. For the men peering through the barbed wire of POW camps, it became evident that their motherland had underestimated this opponent. The psychological impact was tremendous. Accounts later recounted German soldiers professing their sadness after viewing the immensity of American manufacturing. Some confessed that, in that moment, they recognized the battle was unwinnable. They had witnessed with their own eyes the machine that would grind down the Reich. For prisoners who earlier trusted in the certainty of German victory, the sight of unending Sherman tanks waiting on railway sidings was a shattering shock. These impressions were not confined to the prisoners alone. American officials understood the propaganda significance of such displays. The slogan "Arsenal of Democracy," originally pronounced by President Roosevelt, was more than rhetoric. It was a living reality, demonstrated every day by the boom of assembly lines and the thunder of engines being tested. When newsreels displayed images of these massive factories, it was both a message to the American people and a warning to the enemy. This was a war that the United States would not lose. And so, when the German POWs settled into their camps across the American heartland, their imaginations remained tormented by the sights of Detroit's factories. The unending lines of tanks, the clouds of smoke, the relentless laborers. These were not delusions. They were the genuine face of industrial war, and they signified the beginning of Germany's protracted decline. The arsenal of democracy had been exposed, and the men who had once marched beneath the flags of the Reich now carried an indelible recollection of what they had seen. America was not a place of weakness. It was a giant waking, and it was only beginning to move. Next, the story would shift beyond Detroit's industries, to the battlefields where these machines of steel and fire would prove their worth. From the deserts of North Africa to the hedgerows of Normandy, the Sherman tanks developed in America's factories would soon define the fight for Europe. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor, America's war machine had begun to awaken. The nation that had seemed aloof from World War was now completely committed. And while the last chapter portrayed the horror of prisoners who discovered America's huge industrial reach, the deeper truth was still unfolding. The pulsating heart of this revolution rested in a single city. Detroit, the Motor City, would now become the arsenal of democracy. At the outset of the war, Detroit was already the symbol of American growth. It was the city of Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors, where millions of cars rolled off production lines each year. But after December 7, 1941, the identical production plants could no longer afford the luxury of civilian output. President Franklin Roosevelt had declared that America would become the great arsenal, arming not just itself but the Allies with weapons of survival. To achieve that promise, Detroit would need to alter overnight. The scale of this shift was unprecedented. Ford's River Rouge plant, once making beautiful automobiles for American roadways, was retooled into a massive complex building aviation engines, jeeps, and armored vehicles. General Motors geared its operations toward tanks and machine weapons. Chrysler turned its plants into centers of artillery and truck manufacture. These enterprises, previously adversaries in the commercial sphere, were now united under one purpose: defeating the Axis. The most dramatic achievement came in the form of tanks. Chrysler's Detroit Arsenal tank plant became a symbol of what American industry might achieve. Within its cavernous halls, assembly lines cranked out M3 and then M4 Sherman tanks at a speed that startled both allies and enemies. By 1942, hundreds were leaving the facility each month, a pace Germany could not envision matching. Where the Germans handcrafted their machines with accuracy but slow output, Detroit harnessed the strength of mass production to overwhelm. For every German panzer, several Shermans quickly stood ready to confront it. The collaboration between government and industry was equally decisive. Roosevelt's administration created the War Production Board to ensure raw resources, labor, and contracts flowed effectively. Executives like William Knudsen, a former General Motors president, were invited to Washington to apply assembly line mentality to national security. They transformed vehicle efficiency into combat need. The outcome was an industrial juggernaut unlike anything seen before. Workers constituted the backbone of this miracle. Hundreds of thousands flooded into Detroit, many leaving farms or small towns for the first time. Women, too, went into roles hitherto inconceivable. Rosie the Riveter became not just a poster but a reality, as women handled drills, welded steel, and tested engines. Their determination and resilience helped reach quotas that looked unattainable at the start. For many, it was not just about salaries. It was about proving that American families could stand squarely behind the men at the front. But this change was not without strain. Housing shortages plagued Detroit as new workers flocked into the city. Rationing of food and supplies influenced daily life. Strikes periodically occurred as unions fought with demands for continual output. Yet even among these hurdles, the urgency of war spurred production onward. Every new tank, every fresh engine, meant another lifeline for men overseas. The numbers spoke for themselves. By the end of the war, American industry had produced approximately 300,000 airplanes, over 100,000 tanks, and millions of weapons, trucks, and artillery pieces. Much of this output traced its origins back to Detroit and its satellite facilities. Reports from Europe highlighted German surprise at the enormous flood of equipment landing on the battlefield. For every plane lost in combat, another swiftly replaced it. For every tank destroyed, reinforcements swiftly rolled ashore. The adversary learned that defeating American soldiers entailed battling with a supply chain that looked limitless. To grasp the significance, one must remember the German perspective. Their factories underwent regular bombing by Allied air forces. Their labor force was pushed thin, relying on conscripts and inmates. Their potential to replenish was slowly stifled. Meanwhile, Detroit's facilities roared without interruption, sheltered by oceans and propelled by a workforce unified in purpose. It was a contrast that foretold death for the Axis. Beyond the machinery, Detroit symbolizes something deeper, the potential of a free nation to mobilize without losing its spirit. Workers were not slaves of the state but citizens who decided to contribute. Industrial giants did not vanish under government leadership but evolved under instruction. The partnership between democracy and capitalism developed a system that gave triumph without surrendering freedom. This equilibrium, fragile yet efficient, was the essence of the arsenal of democracy. The tanks that rolled from Detroit's lines were not ideal. The Sherman, in particular, was criticized for its poor armor and proclivity to burn when struck. Yet its power resided in reliability and numbers. Crews could count on replacements, extra components, and constant assistance. Unlike Germany, who had fearsome but rare machines like the Tiger, America relied on overwhelming presence. And it was Detroit's unrelenting rhythm that made this feasible. For the men on the front, these weapons became lifelines. A GI in Normandy would never see Detroit, but his survival often depended on its productivity. When convoys landed in Europe, containers branded with Ford or General Motors insignia indicated the hidden hands driving the war effort. The city's industry echoed in every battlefield as American forces approached. As 1945 drew near, the results were undeniable. The arsenal of democracy has accomplished its promise. Detroit's forges, rivets, and assembly lines had armed a nation and its allies to the teeth. German officers seized in the closing months professed shock. They had never dreamed such size was conceivable. For them, the Motor City was not just a place on a map, it was a symbol of their failure. Yet Detroit's war story did not end with production alone. The city had been transformed forever, its workforce reorganized, its industry rerouted. Post-war America would never fully revert to the way things were. The assembly lines that made tanks would soon make automobiles again, but their legacy would stay. They had demonstrated that industry could be the weapon that won a worldwide war. And as victory approached, the stage shifted once more. For America's fleets at sea, the question was no longer whether reinforcements would arrive, but how to wield them against a desperate enemy. The focus switched from industries on land to conflicts across oceans, where destroyers and convoys faced the persistent menace of submarines. From the roar of Detroit's automobile plants came a machine that would define battlefields across 2 continents. Chapter 2 revealed how Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors turned their car factories into engines of war. Now, the true symbol of that transformation rolled out of those doors in steel and firepower, the M4 Sherman tank. Introduced in early 1942, the Sherman became the workhorse of Allied armor. Its design balanced speed, firepower, and reliability in ways no other tank of the era could match. At a time when German engineers prided themselves on the precision of the Panzer IV and the fearsome Tiger, the United States turned instead to sheer numbers. The Sherman was not intended to be a masterpiece of mechanical artistry. It was meant to be built by the tens of thousands, transported across oceans, and fielded on every front where Allied soldiers fought. The philosophy behind the Sherman reflected America's entire industrial approach. Standardized parts, interchangeable across models, allowed for rapid construction and easy repairs in the field. This was no accident. Henry Ford's system of moving assembly lines, perfected decades earlier in the automobile industry, became the template. A tank that once required months of specialized labor in Europe could now be completed in days in America. The scale was staggering. By 1944, nearly 50,000 Sherman tanks had rolled off American assembly lines. They came not only from Detroit but from plants scattered across the Midwest, from Illinois to Ohio. Factories that once built sedans, trucks, and farm equipment now turned out armored hulls and turrets. The transition happened almost overnight, fueled by Roosevelt's vision of the arsenal of democracy. German observers, steeped in a tradition of craftsmanship, could scarcely imagine production on such a scale. Inside the factories, the transformation was visible everywhere. Women who had never worked industrial jobs before became welders, riveters, and machinists. Rows of engines were tested, their roar echoing against steel beams. Conveyor belts carried tank hulls from one station to the next, each step bringing the Sherman closer to completion. In black and white photographs, the process looked mechanical and impersonal, yet for the workers it was personal indeed. Every bolt tightened, every weld completed was a contribution to victory. On the battlefield, the Sherman's presence was immediate. It first entered service in North Africa, where American units faced the Afrika Korps under Erwin Rommel. Though the Sherman sometimes found itself outgunned by heavier German tanks, its reliability and numbers compensated. While German panzer divisions relied on fewer, more complicated machines that often broke down, the Sherman's simpler construction allowed it to keep moving, even in harsh desert conditions. Crews valued its mechanical dependability. For them, survival often depended not on perfection but on whether their tank would start when ordered forward. As the war shifted to Europe, the Sherman appeared in greater and greater numbers. From the hedgerows of Normandy to the forests of the Ardennes, its silhouette became one of the most familiar images of the Allied advance. The tank was not without flaws. Its armor could be pierced by German 88mm guns, and its 75mm main gun sometimes struggled against Tigers and Panthers. Yet Allied commanders understood that the Sherman's true strength lay not in individual duels but in collective power. A single Tiger might dominate a battlefield, but 5 or 6 Shermans advancing together, supported by artillery and air power, could overwhelm even the strongest opponent. The Germans, bound by tradition, clung to limited production of their heavy tanks. Each Tiger required immense resources and long months of labor to complete. America, by contrast, turned out Shermans faster than the enemy could destroy them. The balance of industrial philosophy tilted the outcome. War had become not just a contest of weapons but of manufacturing capacity, logistics, and the ability to replace losses faster than the enemy. Strategically, the Sherman embodied America's role as the supplier not only for its own armies but for its allies. Thousands of Shermans were shipped to Britain, where they formed the backbone of British armored divisions. Others went to the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease program, where Red Army crews used them in brutal battles on the Eastern Front. Each tank shipped overseas was proof that American factories were not only arming their own soldiers but sustaining the fight of entire nations. By late 1944, assembly lines reached their peak. Reports described production figures that stunned observers. Hundreds of tanks emerging every month, shipped on rail cars to ports, then loaded onto Liberty ships bound for Europe and the Pacific. German prisoners captured later in the war often spoke with disbelief at the scale they had witnessed. For them, the Sherman was not merely a machine. It was a symbol of America's inexhaustible resources. Yet the Sherman's legacy was not without sacrifice. Tank crews faced terrifying odds, often advancing under fire against well-dug German positions. Many did not return. Still, the knowledge that replacements would arrive, that more tanks were on the way, sustained morale. The machine and the men who crewed it together represented the will of a nation determined to see the war through to victory. As Allied armies pressed forward into occupied Europe, the Sherman became inseparable from the image of liberation. Its tracks rolled across the ruins of French villages, through the mud of Belgium, and into the heart of Germany itself. Wherever it appeared, it announced not just military strength but the industrial might that lay behind it. The Sherman was a rolling factory product, an armored witness to America's transformation from peacetime economy to wartime superpower. The story of the Sherman tank is not one of perfection but of persistence. Its power came not from unmatched design but from the relentless rhythm of the assembly lines that produced it. Those lines, humming day and night, represented the triumph of mass production over craftsmanship, of numbers over precision. And in the crucible of total war, that triumph would prove decisive. As the Shermans rumbled toward the front lines, attention turned to the men who built them, the workers who kept the lines running, and the ships that carried them across oceans. For the true test of America's arsenal of democracy was not only whether it could build tanks, but whether it could deliver them to the battlefields where they were needed most. The desert sun had scarcely set on the wars of North Africa when the Allies turned their sights toward a new frontier. In the last chapter, we witnessed how the tide of war began to shift as the Axis lost its grip on the Mediterranean. Now, the story switches to the armored behemoth that would take the Allies from the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of Italy, the Sherman tank. When the first American-built M4 Shermans rolled into North Africa in late 1942, they represented not only a weapon but a promise. British forces, battered by years of combat against Rommel's Afrika Korps, suddenly found themselves reinforced with hundreds of reliable, mass-produced tanks. For German soldiers, who had become accustomed to face inferior enemy armor, the sudden emergence of Shermans was a revelation and a shock. At the Second Battle of El Alamein, Montgomery's 8th Army spearheaded the Allied advance with a blend of British and recently arrived American tanks. Rommel's panzers had long ruled the desert battlefield, but the introduction of the Sherman shifted the balance. Its 75mm gun was not the most powerful in the world, although it was good enough to pierce German armor at effective ranges. More crucially, Shermans could be fielded in great numbers. Reports described entire armored brigades approaching where previously only small units of Allied tanks had been able to engage. German testimonies from the front expressed their amazement. Prisoners of war later reported how surprised they were to find the Allies fielding not just a few of new tanks, but entire formations almost overnight. For men acclimated to the image of German technical superiority, the sight of rows of Shermans stretching across the horizon was both confusing and unnerving. The strength of the Sherman was not in perfection, but in output. America's enormous industrial base was suddenly pumping out tanks quicker than Germany could destroy them. For every Panther or Tiger that rolled from German factories, additional Shermans reached the Atlantic. Crews rapidly discovered how to keep them running under the severe desert circumstances. Mechanics swapped engines and replaced tracks with practice speed. This meant Shermans spent more time in action and less time breaking down, a significant advantage in a campaign fought over great distances and hard terrain. By early 1943, the Axis forces in North Africa were retiring under continuous pressure. At fights such as Kasserine Pass, the Allies nevertheless suffered terrible lessons. German panzers inflicted massive fatalities, exposing flaws in Allied cooperation and tactics. Yet even in defeat, the Sherman proved resilient. Unlike many earlier Allied tanks, it could survive strikes that may have otherwise killed lighter vehicles. Crews often managed to bail out and fight again another day. The fall of Tunis in May 1943 signified the end of Axis power in North Africa. For the Allies, it was the first act in a new campaign, the assault of Europe's soft underbelly. As forces prepared to land in Sicily and Italy, Sherman units stood poised in the forefront. The move from desert to mountain combat brought additional obstacles. Narrow passageways, walled villages, and steep ridges hampered maneuver. But once again, the Sherman's reliability and availability provided the Allies an edge. In Sicily, Shermans supported infantry assaults on German and Italian positions dug into rugged slopes. The tank's comparatively modest weight compared to German heavy armor allowed it to penetrate areas where heavier tanks could have struggled. During the advance northward, Shermans encountered German panzers in violent duels. Though they often lacked the brute firepower of the Panzer IV Special or the Tiger, Allied tactics adapted. Numerical advantage, combined with artillery and air support, gradually wore down German positions. By the time Allied troops arrived onto the Italian mainland, the Sherman had become a symbol of relentless velocity. At Salerno and later at Anzio, the tank's presence proved critical in holding weak beachheads against aggressive counterattacks. German commanders noticed with frustration that for every armored group they destroyed, fresh waves of Shermans arrived to take their place. It was a stunning exhibition of the industrial prowess underpinning the Allied war effort. For captured German soldiers, the realization was progressively apparent. Some POWs reported that the Allies seemed to have a limitless supply of tanks, trucks, and artillery. What they had formerly rejected as substandard computers were suddenly emerging in such numbers that quality mattered less than quantity. The psychological impact was tremendous. Facing a wall of Shermans advancing slowly across the battlefield, many knew that time and resources were no longer on Germany's side. The Shermans' role in North Africa and Italy established the foundation for far larger fights to come. In these wars, Allied commanders learned how to integrate armor with infantry, artillery, and air force. They honed the tactics of combined arms warfare that would soon be unleashed in France. The Sherman was not perfect. It was vulnerable to heavy German weapons and frequently criticized for being underpowered, but it was present in numbers that no opponent could ignore. By 1944, whole armored divisions equipped with Shermans were ready to charge the beaches of Normandy. The lessons of desert and mountain battle had hardened crews and commanders alike. What began as a careful introduction in North Africa has become the backbone of Allied ground offensives across Europe. As the chapter of Italy finished, the Allies prepared for their toughest task yet, launching a Western Front in France. The Sherman, built in American factories and blooded in African deserts, was about to encounter the full fury of German armor on the plains of Normandy. The road from El Alamein to Rome had demonstrated that industrial strength could overcome technological superiority. The next chapter would reveal if this momentum could bring the Allies across the Channel and into the heart of Hitler's fortress Europe. From the deserts of North Africa and the rocky hills of Italy, the Sherman had already established its usefulness. But nothing could prepare the world for what happened when Allied industry hauled this armored workhorse across the English Channel. The lessons learnt in Tunisia and Salerno now collided in the greatest amphibious invasion in history. Normandy would demonstrate not just the strength of Allied soldiers, but the stunning power of Allied supplies. At dawn on June 6, 1944, the beaches of France exploded under the thunder of battle. Thousands of landing craft raced toward the dunes, bringing infantry, engineers, and armor. Among them were hundreds of Sherman tanks, meticulously prepared for the unique circumstances of D-Day. Some were fitted with flotation screens to swim ashore. Others bore enormous plows or flamethrowers designed to smash German defenders. German defenders, ensconced in concrete bunkers and firing from high positions, believed they could repel the invasion. For years, they had erected defenses along the Atlantic Wall, thinking that a handful of well-placed cannons could block any landing. And in the opening hours, their firing was terrible. Tanks sank in the surf. Crews drowned before reaching dry land. Yet, despite these casualties, wave after wave of Shermans continued to arrive. What startled many German soldiers was not the individual tank, but the volume of the assault. Reports from the front indicated how, even after destroying scores of vehicles, additional Shermans continued arriving. American supply ships anchored offshore unloaded replacement tanks with mechanical precision. For every machine disabled by mines or artillery, another was already on its way from the holds of Liberty ships. By midday, Shermans were mounting the bluffs at Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. Their tracks cut through sand and dirt while troops followed close behind. Together, they moved inland, busting through wire, trenches, and pillboxes. The scene was overwhelming. Survivors reported how German defenders, previously confident, come to understand that the invasion was unlike anything they had ever faced. Behind this display lied the actual miracle: logistics. The United States had devised a system of supply that performed like clockwork. In England, enormous depots had been created to stockpile tanks, vehicles, gasoline, and ammunition. On the beaches, engineers developed artificial docks, known as mulberries, to dump supplies even when ports remained under German hands. Within days of the landings, Allied forces were getting thousands of tons of material every day. For the Sherman, this meant that losses could be replenished nearly instantly. Crews destroyed in one engagement were swiftly replaced by fresh tanks rolling off ships. Mechanics toiled diligently in makeshift workshops near the beaches, putting damaged tanks back into action. It was a display of industrial depth that Germany just could not match. The escape from Normandy demonstrated the full implications of this system. In the hedgerows of the French countryside, warfare was harsh. German Panther and Tiger tanks lurked in ambush, striking off Shermans at startling rates. But each time Allied formations sustained losses, they emerged with increased power. Convoys carried new tanks via hurriedly repaired roads, ensuring that no unit remained under strength for long. German leaders grew increasingly desperate. Reports from captured personnel stated that while German tanks were technically superior in many ways, they could not be produced or replaced fast enough. Allied logistics meant that, for every Sherman destroyed, 2 more seemed to come. This continuous pressure slowly ground down even the most seasoned panzer divisions. As the summer carried on, the balance tipped dramatically. During Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy, Sherman spearheaded the drive through German lines. Supported by overwhelming artillery and air force, they rushed into wide ground, finally escaping the deadly hedgerows. Here, numbers became critical. Allied armored columns stretched as far as the eye could see, a rolling wave of steel propelled by continuous convoys of gasoline and ammunition. For German troops, the experience was terrible. POWs later revealed their surprise at the scope of Allied resources. Destroyed bridges were reconstructed overnight. Bombed supply lines were immediately replaced. And everywhere, Shermans emerged, approaching with steady resolve. Many recognized that Germany was no longer battling just an army, but an industrial empire capable of sustaining war on a scale they could not conceive. The ramifications of Normandy stretched well beyond the beaches. Once the lodgment was secure, the Allies created massive supply bases, pouring the full weight of American industry onto the continent. From these stockpiles poured a continual stream of tanks, trucks, and fuel. The Sherman, there in overwhelming numbers, became the spearhead of a campaign that would push across France, liberating city after city. In this chapter of the conflict, the actual strength of the Allies was shown, not in a single battle or weapon, but in the ability to sustain combat without pause. The Germans could battle skillfully, inflict enormous losses, and even gain local successes. But they could not outlive a system that could send more troops, more equipment, and more supplies every single day. By the time Paris was liberated in August 1944, the pattern was clear. German defenses were failing under the sheer weight of Allied logistics. The Sherman, formerly ridiculed for its lighter armor and firepower, has proven invincible when backed by an infinite supply network. It was no longer a matter of if the Allies could advance, but how swiftly they could go. As German forces retreated eastward, Allied leaders planned for the next phase, crossing into the heart of Germany itself. The narrative of Normandy had demonstrated that the war would not be decided by individual tanks or even individual battles. It would be decided by the capacity to replace casualties faster than the enemy could inflict them. And in that struggle, the Allies enjoyed the ultimate advantage. The road ahead would lead to the woodlands of Belgium and the icy fields of the Ardennes. There, the Sherman would once again meet its biggest test, as Hitler launched a desperate counteroffensive to turn the tide. The triumphs in Normandy had exposed the strength of American logistics in the West. Yet, even as Shermans marched across France, another front was being supplied with the same machines. Across oceans, mountains, and icebound seas, the United States was shipping tanks not only for its own soldiers, but for its allies. And on the Eastern Front, those deliveries were beginning to influence perceptions of the war. Through the Lend-Lease program, Washington devoted tremendous resources to sustaining the Soviet Union. Factories in Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh turned out equipment meant not for American divisions, but for Red Army troops fighting thousands of miles away. Among the weaponry delivered were almost 4,000 Sherman tanks, carefully loaded onto cargo vessels and dispatched on long, risky journeys. These convoys risked dangerous waters. North Atlantic storms pounded the ships, as German U-boats prowled beneath the waves. Surface raiders and planes stalked them from Norway to the Barents Sea. Yet despite these hazards, the goods came. At the ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, Soviet dockworkers unloaded crates, trucks, and tanks in staggering numbers. For Soviet soldiers, the landing of the Sherman was a visual symbol of Allied commitment. Though the Red Army's own T-34 was already a legendary machine, the advent of American tanks increased their arsenal. Reports depicted Soviet troops going inside Shermans with curiosity, noticing their radios, optics, and surprisingly comfortable interiors. To those who had battled in hard conditions, the new arrivals offered another instrument of war and another cause to believe in success. On the battlefield, Shermans were integrated with T-34s in mixed formations. In confrontations from 1943 onward, German troops began encountering both Soviet and American designs on the same front. For panzer crews accustomed to confronting solely red-built machines, the sight was startling. Accounts from detainees afterward emphasized their disbelief. They had expected to confront one industrial rival. Instead, they found themselves challenged by two, their combined strength impossible to ignore. The presence of Shermans on the Eastern Front confirmed a developing realization throughout German ranks. The Reich was being ringed not merely geographically, but industrially. In the West, American and British units advanced with unlimited supplies. In the East, Soviet soldiers now battled with armaments taken not only from their own factories, but from across the Atlantic. The idea of being surrounded was no longer abstract. It was made concrete by the silhouettes of Sherman tanks rolling across Russian farms. For the Red Army, these deliveries were part of a bigger flow of support. Alongside tanks came thousands of vehicles, trains, aircraft, and masses of raw materials. Fuel, food, and clothes kept Soviet soldiers in the field throughout critical winters. Without such aid, offensives might have stopped or mobility might have faltered. The Sherman was merely one element of this broader puzzle, but its function carried symbolic weight far beyond its numbers. American manufacturing guaranteed that replacements continued to arrive. Even when tanks were lost in combat, other ones disembarked from convoys to take their place. This paralleled the similar trend witnessed in Normandy, when losses were rapidly replaced by fresh shipments. The difference was geography. Here, over the frigid oceans and enormous stretches of Eurasia, the logistical achievement was just as amazing. The German command recognized the ramifications. Intelligence reports warned of foreign tanks fighting in Soviet service. Soldiers wrote home about captured equipment wearing American markings. Slowly, the conclusion spread. No matter how skillful or determined German divisions were, they could not hope to survive such a coalition. Industrial strength was converging against them on every front. For Soviet crews, the Sherman was welcomed with mixed opinions. Its cannon was less powerful than later German armor, and its silhouette higher than the T-34. Yet its durability, ease of maintenance, and regular availability of spare parts guaranteed it remained useful. In the grim mathematics of the Eastern Front, a tank that could battle consistently was as valuable as one that could claim individual superiority. The symbolic significance, however, outweighed technical disputes. To the Red Army, American gifts were a reminder that they were not fighting alone. To German soldiers, these were proof that the war was becoming unwinnable. And to the Allies as a whole, they were evidence that cooperation could be formed not only in strategy but in steel. By late 1944, as Soviet armies moved through Belarus and into Poland, Shermans advanced beside T-34s in extended columns. Dust erupted from their tracks as they passed bridges and rivers, traveling westward toward the heart of Europe. For citizens watching from villages, the image was unforgettable. American machines decorated with Soviet stars, part of a coalition united in purpose. The Eastern Front had traditionally been the bloodiest theater of the conflict. But suddenly it also became a stage on which Allied industry demonstrated its reach. From the factories of America to the fields of Ukraine, a supply chain stretched unbroken. This was more than logistics. It was the visible indication of an alliance closing in from all directions. For Germany, each new sighting of a Sherman on the Eastern Front underscored the inevitability of loss. Surrounded in the west, pummeled in the sky, and now pressured by a Red Army bolstered with foreign machines, the Wehrmacht was fighting against history itself. As Soviet tanks rolled toward the Vistula, Allied planners turned to the future. Soon, the separate offensives in east and west would converge. And in that confluence, the Sherman would once again play its place, charging forward not just as an American weapon, but as a symbol of Allied unity. The following chapter would extend that solidarity into the heart of occupied Europe, where the struggle for Germany itself awaited. The Eastern Front had demonstrated the strength of Allied production through Sherman's entering in Soviet service. Yet, as winter deepened in Western Europe, the German army made its final great bet. In December 1944, Hitler launched a huge counteroffensive through the Ardennes. It would be remembered as the Battle of the Bulge. The opening was rapid, forceful, and overwhelming. On December 16th, German gunfire blasted across the misty hills of Belgium and Luxembourg. Panzer divisions pushed forward, reinforced by soldiers who felt this surprise offensive may break the Allied front in two. For a brief while, the gamble looked to work. American units were taken off surprise. Roads congested with retreating automobiles. Towns and communities, formerly deemed secure, fell under surprise attack. But the Ardennes was no longer the battlefield of 1940. Unlike the startled French army 4 years before, the United States was backed by an industrial base that never appeared to collapse. In the early hours of the conflict, frontline GIs battled fiercely to block the German onslaught. At places like Bastogne and St. Vith, thin lines of defenders bought crucial time. And time was all that was needed, because behind them rolled the relentless wave of American reinforcements. Sherman tanks appeared in numbers that startled both friend and foe. For German soldiers, accustomed to shortages of fuel, ammo, and spare components, the sight was depressing. Captured prisoners later recounted with surprise at how swiftly the Americans replaced their losses. A Sherman knocked out in one engagement seems to be replaced the very next day by 2 more. The weather played in Germany's favor at initially. Low clouds and snow halted Allied aircraft, obscuring the skies where American air dominance typically reigned. But on the ground, convoys never halted. Military police supervised traffic on frozen highways, guiding armored columns toward the front. Supply trucks went day and night, their headlights covered with slits, their engines groaning through the cold. Even under the harshest conditions, the American arsenal delivered. By contrast, German panzers advanced with caution. Their Tiger and Panther tanks were formidable machines, but they were scarce in number, and each required tremendous quantities of gasoline. As spearheads advanced westward, shortages got severe. Abandoned vehicles cluttered the roadside, not destroyed by enemy fire but left behind empty of gasoline. The Wehrmacht's bold plan relied on speed, but instead, its columns slowed with every mile. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division held firm. Surrounded and outnumbered, they fought several assaults. When the weather eventually lifted, Allied planes surged overhead. Supply drops supported the defenders, while bombers devastated German defenses. On the ground, Sherman reinforcements closed in from every direction. For the Americans, there seemed to be no limit to the resources flowing into the fight. For the Germans, the realization grew grim. Every day, their power dropped while the Allies only seemed to expand. Reports spread swiftly among captured German soldiers. They spoke of awe at how swiftly the Americans replaced entire regiments. For those taught to believe in German efficiency, it was astounding to see an opponent capable of deploying such limitless reinforcements. Some POWs described watching train after train unload more tanks and trucks, as though the industrial machine behind the lines had no boundaries. The battle continued for weeks. Snow-covered woodlands became killing grounds, as tanks clashed in frozen fields and artillery thundered through the night. Civilians hid in cellars, their communities decimated by the shifting lines of conflict. For the German army, it was a test of endurance they could not win. Each advance was met with a counterattack, each breakthrough sealed by waves of fresh American armor. By early January 1945, the tide had entirely turned. What had begun as a daring onslaught turned a frantic retreat. The German army had hurled its last reserves into the Ardennes, only to watch them consumed. Panzer divisions, once the pride of Hitler's Wehrmacht, were decimated. Thousands of guys were taken prisoner. The prospect of separating the Allies had vanished, and with it, the last hope of recovering the initiative in the West. Strategically, the implications were severe. The Battle of the Bulge lost Germany precious tanks, equipment, and personnel. From that point onward, the Wehrmacht would fight only on the defensive. Meanwhile, American manufacturing continued to support not just its own forces but also those of Britain and the Soviet Union. The sight of Shermans arriving in seemingly continuous convoys had made a lasting effect on German POWs. To them, it reaffirmed what many had feared, that the war was unwinnable against such overwhelming production. For the United States, the Ardennes campaign displayed the resilience of its men and the vast capacity of its industry. Detroit and Pittsburgh, Chicago and New York had sent forth their products in steel and rubber, in engines and munitions. What appeared on the battlefield was not only the spirit of fighting men, but the united weight of an industrial nation at war. As the snows of January melted into the muck of spring, the German army no longer had the strength to undertake significant offensives. The path now led steadily eastward, across the Rhine, and into the heart of the Third Reich itself. The failure in the Ardennes signaled the ultimate turning point in the West. And while American soldiers gathered for the crossing into Germany, another chapter of the war was about to unfold. From the skies above, bombers prepared to wreak damage deeper into the Reich, signifying the beginning of the final drive toward triumph. The Ardennes had exposed Germany's last attempt to turn the tide. Yet even there, as panzers fought through the snow, American reinforcements never seemed to cease. Now the issue arose. How had the Allies kept such momentum, despite the mechanical deficiencies of their most popular tank? The Sherman, formerly the M4, was far from flawless. German crews knew this well. In direct battle, Tigers and Panthers held the advantage. With their strong armor and high-velocity cannons, they could destroy a Sherman at ranges where the American tank failed to retaliate. Many GIs referred to their machines bitterly as Ronsons, after the lighter that always lighted on the first strike, because too often, once hit, a Sherman burned. But the story of the Sherman was not defined by individual duels. It was defined by something broader, something that reshaped the battlefield itself. While Tigers rolled out of factories in limited numbers, every week thousands of Shermans left American assembly lines. By the end of the war, more than 49,000 had been made. The German army, despite its engineering skill, could never compete with that scale. On the battlefield, this meant the Allies could afford what the Germans could not: attrition. A Tiger might destroy many Shermans in a single fight, but inevitably more arrived. American tank crews could rely on replacements not in months, but often in days. Entire units refilled themselves while still holding the line. The psychological effect was terrible for the opponent. German POWs later expressed their horror at seeing waves of tanks that looked endless, an iron river advancing no matter how many were killed. Reliability was another weapon in the Sherman's favor. Its engine was less powerful than the enormous Maybachs that drove the Tiger, but it consumed significantly less fuel and rarely broke down under load. In the muck of Normandy, in the snow of the Ardennes, in the heat of North Africa, Shermans kept pushing where larger German armor stalled. Mechanics could fix them fast, using interchangeable components and standardized tools. Entire tanks might be rebuilt and returned to duty in days. For German crews, the contrast was severe. The Tiger was a mighty machine, but complex and fragile. A breakdown deep behind the front generally meant abandonment, because towing such a vehicle was practically impossible without massive resources. Panthers, too, faced mechanical difficulties, especially in their early models. As the war stretched on and shortages worsened, these faults proved crippling. The Sherman's strengths lie in its balance. It was not the greatest in armor, nor the most potent in armament, but it could be produced, transported, fueled, and repaired in large numbers. For leaders like Eisenhower and Montgomery, this reliability affected strategy itself. They could plan offensives knowing their armored divisions would arrive in strength, and that casualties would be promptly replaced. On the front lines, tank crews knew both the danger and the reassurance. Facing a Tiger head-on was a daunting prospect. Many depended on maneuver, calling in artillery or aircraft to level the playing field. Yet they also knew that their tanks would not run out. The next day, another column would arrive. That knowing gave them confidence. It gave them endurance. German soldiers, by contrast, battled under a shadow of scarcity. Every tank lost was a blow that could not be easily rectified. By 1944, gasoline shortages left entire divisions immobile. Some reports claimed tanks abandoned for lack of gasoline, their workers having to evacuate on foot. Even when Panthers and Tigers entered the field, they did so in limited numbers, their strength spread out across large fronts. Against them came the Shermans, not in twos or tens, but in hundreds. The impact was not simply tactical but psychological. German detainees told Allied interrogators of their disbelief. They had been indoctrinated to consider their own armor as superior in quality. Yet they confronted an enemy that never seemed to run dry. Battles that should have favored the Wehrmacht instead turned into conflicts of endurance. And endurance was a fight Germany could not win. This contrast showed a deeper truth about the struggle. The Second World War was not just decided by tactics or valor, but by industry. The United States had harnessed its industry into an arsenal that supplied the world. The Sherman embodied that reality. Its inherent shortcomings were obscured by the sheer fact of its numbers. Where one tank fell, another replaced it. Where a division failed, another pushed ahead, steel and fire drawn from a seemingly limitless source. By early 1945, as the Allies crossed into Germany, the pattern was evident. Tigers and Panthers still fought, still murdered, still horrified all who encountered them. But they could not alter the outcome. The Sherman, multiplied 1,000-fold, assured the advance never stopped. Every route east carried their tracks. Every battleground bore their presence. For German soldiers, the lesson was plain. They had been outproduced, outlasted, and swamped. Technical superiority had not saved them. In the end, it was the continuous flood of Shermans that shattered their will. And as the Allies prepared to drive deeper into the Reich, the war's last chapters would expose another facet of this overpowering strength, when not just tanks, but the skies themselves delivered destruction on a scale no army had ever confronted. The final blows of the Reich had already been inflicted. In the previous chapter, we witnessed how Allied advances strengthened their grip, forcing German armies into retreat. Now the war entered its final act. And it was not simply on the battlefield where Germany was defeated. It was in the industries of America, where production continued at a pace so dizzying that German prisoners of war struggled to fathom it. By the spring of 1945, the data told the narrative more clearly than any speech or newspaper headline. The United States had turned its economy into a war machine, producing tanks, aircraft, ships, and weaponry on a scale no nation had ever matched. That year alone, more than 19,000 tanks rolled out of American factories, each one heading for Europe or the Pacific. It was a number that dwarfed the capability of German industry, which by then was being smashed daily under unrelenting Allied bombing attacks. German POWs captured during the Ruhr battle offered testimony to this discrepancy. Many had fought desperately with the remnants of panzer divisions, relying on tanks that were routinely hurried from workshops without appropriate testing, often lacking replacement parts or fuel. When they realized that America had built in 1 year more armored vehicles than Germany could in many, astonishment was the only reaction they could offer. To them, it appeared unfathomable that an enemy could sustain such volume without pause, even while battling on 2 oceans and feeding millions of troops across continents. Inside America's industrial cities, the effort never slowed. Detroit's auto industry, formerly devoted to making automobiles for families, had been repurposed into assembly lines for war. Ford's vast Willow Run facility became famous for producing a B-24 Liberator bomber every hour, but tank manufacturers in places like Lima, Ohio, and facilities run by Chrysler and General Motors cranked out Sherman after Sherman with the same unrelenting pace. The manufacturing line had been perfected years previously, but wartime urgency brought new speed and efficiency. This constant productivity was not without hardship. Workers experienced lengthy shifts, rationed consumables, and continual pressure to reach quotas. Yet the morale behind the effort remained high. Women took up jobs in machine shops, riveting armor plates and calibrating engines, while thousands of males unfit for the draft contributed by welding, casting, and testing. The arsenal of democracy, as President Roosevelt had once called it, was not a slogan. It was a reality visible in steel, rubber, and artillery. By comparison, German industry was withering under the combined weight of air raids and resource shortages. Oil fields in Romania had been bombarded. Rail lines were broken. Factories were reduced to ruins. Even the legendary Tiger and Panther tanks, technologically superior and feared on the battlefield, could not be built in quantities that matched their necessity. In 1944, Germany produced fewer than 6,000 tanks. Against tens of thousands of Allied Shermans, Grants, and Churchills, even their superior armor could not swing the balance. Prisoners seized in the Ruhr pocket saw this firsthand. They were marched by unending convoys of American trucks, lines of tanks stretching beyond the horizon, and supply depots heaped high with crates of ammunition and fuel. Many of them confessed in interrogation reports that the sight was overwhelming. For soldiers who had been misled that the Allies were weak, fragmented, or dependent on British leadership, the reality was devastating. They had been vanquished not merely by generals and strategy, but by a nation that could outproduce every adversary combined. The strategic repercussions were evident. With such depth of supplies, American commanders could launch offensives without worry of lack. Damaged tanks were replaced soon. Divisions that lost equipment in the Ardennes counteroffensive were resupplied within weeks. Where German divisions had to retreat or halt for lack of gasoline or spare parts, American units drove forward with an unlimited stream of replacements. This imbalance expedited the final collapse of Nazi Germany. By April 1945, as Allied forces drove across the Rhine and deep into the German heartland, the production disparity became more than statistics. It was a crushing weight on the German soldiers' morale. Facing opponents whose vehicles never appeared to run out, whose artillery never ceased, and whose planes darkened the skies in unrelenting waves, surrender became not just likely, but inevitable. For American troops, the scale of their own support was both reassuring and humbling. Many infantrymen spoke of the confidence they had knowing replacement tanks were always behind them, that trucks supplied food and ammunition in unending convoys, and that bombers continually took off each morning despite casualties. It gave them a sense of assurance in battle, a conviction that no matter how intense the German resistance, the tide could not be reversed. And for the German prisoners, the shock remained seared in their memory. Some informed interrogators that had their own factories not been hit, they still could not conceive the enormous scale of American manufacturing. Others stated that the idea of German dominance had been destroyed when they realized a single American plant could equal the monthly output of vast sections of the Reich. By the end of the war in Europe, the truth was apparent. America's economic prowess had not only supplied its own forces, but also armed the Allies through initiatives like Lend-Lease. Soviet tank brigades and British armored divisions had battled with vehicles, fuel, and weapons branded, "Made in the USA." The war was a trial of heroism and strategy, but it was also a contest of steel, oil, and technology. And in that struggle, America's factories had surpassed Germany until the final surrender. As German resistance weakened and the Allies prepared to declare victory in Europe, one concern loomed. What would happen to this massive industrial force once the guns went silent? The answer would define the post-war world, as the arsenal of democracy morphed into the backbone of American dominance in the decades to come. The final collapse of the Reich had shown the truth in numbers. In the previous chapter, we saw how American industries surpassed German industry until the dying days of the war. Now, when the guns went silent and surrender was signed, captive German soldiers pondered on what they had witnessed. An industrial power so enormous and unrelenting that it seemed unstoppable. In May 1945, across wrecked towns and shattered front lines, prisoners of war were gathered by the hundreds of thousands. Many had fought in tank battalions or infantry regiments, clinging to weapons that had long since been outnumbered and outgunned. Their memories of the battlefield were defined not only by defeat, but by astonishment at the enemy's capacity to supply and sustain. To them, the Sherman tank became the clearest embodiment of this inequality. The Sherman was not the heaviest tank of the war. German aircrew regularly reminded interrogators that their Panthers and Tigers were stronger in armor and carried more powerful weaponry. Yet what struck them was not the quality of one vehicle, it was the sheer volume. On the Western Front, Shermans arrived in wave after wave, supported by continuous convoys of fuel and spare parts. Even when whole companies were annihilated in combat, replacements pushed forward within days. Reports from POWs captured in the Ruhr campaign depicted lengthy columns of American armor stretching to the horizon, supported by half-tracks, trucks, and artillery. For soldiers accustomed to shortages, malfunctions, and supply gaps, it was tough to fathom. Factories in Detroit, Chicago, and Cleveland had seized the same production lines that had made vehicles and turned them into engines of war. Cars became tanks. Farms produced not only food, but raw materials for explosives and fuel. Every element of American life seemed to have been altered for a single objective. This shift was more than mechanical, it was cultural. Captured soldiers expressed surprise that women had operated assembly lines, welding steel plates and riveting aircraft, while farmers cultivated commodities that were carried overseas to feed millions of Allied troops. What they witnessed was a nation mobilized in fully, not partially, for war. For Germany, reeling with shortages of oil, coal, and labor, the contrast could not have been clearer. The memories of POWs held recurring motifs. Some told of the limitless skies filled with American bombers, each one requiring parts, engines, and men that Germany could no longer match. Others remembered the shock of witnessing fresh divisions armed with new vehicles, even late in 1945, when their own army relied on aging equipment pushed far past its limitations. Above all, they knew that America's industrial base had become a weapon as decisive as any rifle or tank gun. The Sherman tank, in particular, epitomized this truth. With more than 49,000 built during the war, it became the most commonly produced medium tank of the battle. German soldiers observed how its mechanical durability allowed it to keep moving where bigger vehicles sometimes failed. Spare components were usually accessible. Fuel was abundant. Crews rotated in and out, knowing replacements stood waiting. Against this, even the most proficient panzer divisions fought to preserve coherence. Yet the reflection of POWs was not merely about machines, it was about fate. By the time American forces crossed the Rhine and moved into central Germany, many men stated that they no longer believed victory was attainable. The sight of convoys, depots, and armor reinforced the idea that they had been battling an opponent not merely on the battlefield, but on an industrial scale beyond comprehension. In the days after surrender, Allied intelligence officers collected these reports. Again and again, the same conclusion appeared. Germany had overestimated America's ability to organize, believing distance, resources, and resolve would restrict its involvement. Instead, the United States had harnessed its immense resources with astonishing efficiency. The outcome was an uninterrupted line of supply that swung the tide on every front where its men fought. For the convicts themselves, this realization carried a mix of disbelief and admiration. Some claimed they had been informed that American soldiers relied on computers because they lacked discipline. But when they witnessed factories that never stopped, farms that produced constantly, and ships that ferried supplies over the Atlantic without pause, the idea of American weakness shattered. The military machine they faced had been constructed not simply on steel, but on organization, spirit, and determination. As weeks went into months, POW camps across Europe became places of reflection. German soldiers discussed among themselves how the Sherman had become more than a tank. It was a symbol of America's change. What had previously been autos rolling off peacetime lines had become armored brigades. What had formerly been consumer industries had become arsenals. And what had previously been a faraway nation had evolved as the major industrial force of the modern world. For the Allies, these observations emphasized the wider truth of the battle. Victory had been accomplished not just through heroism on the battlefield, but by the capacity to sustain that war indefinitely. The Sherman tank, mass-produced and ever-present, captured that reality in steel form. It was the personification of a war fought with logistics as much as with strategy, with industry as much as with soldiers. As German POWs looked back, they brought with them a vision that would be engraved in memory. Columns of Sherman tanks rolling over Europe, accompanied by the unceasing stream of troops and supplies that constituted the American war effort. To them, it was confirmation that they had faced a military machine that could not be stopped. And as the conflict finished, the globe itself grasped the ramifications. America's industrial prowess had influenced the result of the Second World War. In the years to follow, it would also shift the balance of global power. The arsenal of democracy had not merely guaranteed victory, it had established a new era.